There's a force driving me that keeps telling me, go do this.
September 1957, Nigeria. First stop on my route into exile.
Eskia moves out of South Africa at the height of African nationalism, a time when, most African countries were fighting for their, struggle for independence. And he moves out. Clearly, repression has heightened too in South Africa. And, it enters into this world current of debate that was seeking, to change things within South Africa and beyond. And alongside leading scholars, from Africa that were resident in the U.S., resident in France, he played a fairly important role, in trying to shape the nature of anti-colonial debates that were taking place around this time.
4 years you looked for the smell and feel of place. It was there all right. The smell of Lagos, the smell of Ibadan, the harmattan scouring the savannas of the north, the harmattan, that dry desert wind, the abundance of humanity in Nigeria and Ghana and their theatrical lifestyles. First there was a scintillating sense of freedom and daytime after the South African nightmare. You wanted to slow down, shake off the cold sweat after the nightmare had spat you out into the full glare of Nigerian daytime. You had to stop clawing around in search of opposition, of insult. You got to know that the immigrant's journey is a long, long road. A heavy road, yes. Basking in this Nigerian heat, I feel cool inside me. I stretch myself like the lizards there on the warm concrete wall. I have brought with me prejudices and anger to a country where they're almost altogether alien now. I am breathing the new air of freedom, and now the barrel of gall has no bottom anymore. I shall soon know what to do with this freedom. For the moment, I'm still baffled, and my canoe still feels the momentum that launched it in 2nd Avenue. But what a glorious sense of release. In December 1958, I was invited to Kwame Nkrumah's All-African People's Conference in Accra. As Ghana was the only African country that had been freed from the European colonialism that had swept over the continent in the 19th century, most of the countries represented at Accra were still colonies. Ethiopia and Liberia were also there, but not Sudan. The Ghanaians in their togas walked with admirable pomp. The atmosphere was most elevating. Inspired by Nkrumah, we heard the rumble of wheels of freedom's chariot just around the corner. The late Patrick Duncan and Jordan Ngubane were present, representing the South African liberal view. Alfred Hutchinson, then in Ghana after his flight from the treason trial in South Africa, walked in during a plenary session. The 4 of us had our turn to meet the great leader and talk to him. I found myself on the Race Discrimination Commission of the conference, together with Kenneth Kaunda. Frantz Fanon from Algeria delivered a fiery speech against colonialism. His calm face and manner belied the high-tension wires within him.
And when we went to Nigeria, we saw a formidable culture there. Nigerians are that formidable images, formidable art, three-dimensional arts, plastic arts, formidable graphic arts, formidable dance and movement. Nigerians, we found Nigerians are very theatrical people. You like to wave their arms when they talk, and also they cried very easily. Nigerians cried very easily, unlike back home there, where people are just so hard and tough.
I had moved out of a literary renaissance among blacks in South Africa into another, a West African one, which was in full swing, having begun with the decade of the 50s. It was exciting to work with and be in the company of Nigerian writers, artists, actors, and educators. Wole Soyinka, playwright, poet, novelist; Gabriel Okara, poet; Mabel Shegun, poet; Amos Tutuola, novelist; sculptor Ben Onowu, painters Demis Nwonko, Uche Okeke, and so on. If Wole can be compared with lightning and thunder, trailing clouds of fury and indignation, Chinua Achebe is like the soft, warm rain of the Nigerian climate. While Wole's prose diction evokes an image of high-tension wires, word after word seeping belatedly into the reader's consciousness because of their difficulty, Chinua's prose sings and abounds with echoes of human voices, sees more into the human scene than he will let on, eyeball to eyeball. His sense of humor is gentle, where Wole's has the fullness and speed of fierce waterfalls.
How shall I call it? In African-centered sense of self, an African-centered institutions. We need those very badly, because that is one way in which we can plant the seeds of the seeds for that sense of Africanness, so that we're not always copying what the West is doing, that we ourselves can be confident with ourselves, so we can feel that we are strong enough to create standards of our own.
There was a debate in the 60s that he helped shed a great light on. And I think without that kind of immersion in Paris even, we might have been talking at cross purposes across each other. The Francophone Africans, including those from the Caribbean, had come up with a particularly appealing, at least to the emotions, to the heart, doctrine of negritude. That was for them essentially an attempt to espouse an African aesthetic, genuine to that extent. Except that it got to be reductionist and oversimplified African phenomenon, including African culture as well, and equated it with the pristine, with the primitive, and so on.
Eskia believed that in order to understand the African personality, you have to look at, his reality as a totality, an integrated being, which encapsulates his spiritual dimension, which it could not be separated from the material, element. This is something which Western philosophy had tried to separate, and which, the negritude scholars tried so much, to fight back. The mistake that they made was to insist that if the West is saying that we are irrational, then we will go ahead and say, yes, we are. If the West is saying that we are all emotion, we'll go out of our way and say, yes, we are all but emotion. But as Kia insists that we are more than that, yes, we need to listen to our intuition. Yes, we need to pay, attention to our emotions. But at the same time, the Africans are also material, they are also rational, and there is no need to separate the two. The emotional and the material go hand in hand, and that is what makes a total being.
And Prof is one of the first people to simply say Senghor's negritude is not on. And at that time, people were like startled. Why would he denigrate something as powerful as negritude, which in our times might translate into black consciousness? Now, if you were to say black consciousness is not on, but he had the courage to simply say it doesn't work, and he could postulate why he would say it doesn't work, because it removed the intellect from African people and simply said, look, African people are all about emotion and things like that, just as an antithesis of a Western personality, which Prof disproved of. He would clearly say, look, we are a violent people, we are a people who massacre each other, who do dirty things to one another and things like that. So it's not all as if we are an antithesis of Europe and Africa being the opposite of everything that is bad in Europe. He could see both the good and the bad in us.
To understand and define yourself, you need to start by defining yourself from self-knowledge, from your own understanding, rather than using, a given paradigm, in order to define yourself. Because the negative people were using, the negative scholars were using, a Western paradigm as their starting point. And as Kia was saying, for us to understand ourselves, we need to start from, the African self. And the African self says that knowledge cannot be fragmented. A people cannot be fragmented. The spiritual is inseparable from the material. And I think, for me, that was a major contribution, a major intervention that he made around about this period.
For 3 years, I chewed dust. I got high on the harmattan as it deposited its Saharan silt in my nostrils, sucking them dry in the process. But enough of the travels of an extramural donkey. France. No sense of place, no commitment, no desire to be sucked into French intellectual life, especially at the peak of the Franco-Algerian troubles from 1961 to 63, still straining at the tether that tied you to the center of the South African experience. The tyranny of place, of time, was taking on a symbolic meaning. That is, the inner compulsion to hold on to the smells and texture of Southern life.
I was lucky enough to be in an international cultural organization called the set up by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. My job was to direct African programs, and which meant that I had to travel a lot in Africa from the Paris base, especially West Africa, East Africa, a little part of Central Africa, and wherever the Congress for Cultural Freedom got an appeal from an African country to come and help them in their cultural work, especially financially, I went.
We lived on Boulevard du Montparnasse, just off Saint-Michel, a few blocks from the Low Select and La Guillaume restaurants. Our apartment was to become a kind of crossroads for writers and artists. Wale Soyinka, Gambian poet Lenry Peters, Richard Rive, South African poet in exile Mazizi Kunene, Bob Leshwai, who was running a traveling theater from province to province in South Africa, B.M. Kaketla, grammarian and poet from Lesotho, the late Soas Jones Kwati, Ghanaian scholar, Kofi Awono, Ghanaian poet and a beloved friend, J.P. Clark, Nigerian broadcaster Emmanuel Omashola, artists like Julian Beinart, Peter Clark, Dennis Durden, and the South African immigré Gerard Sekoto and Brayton Breitenbach, both of whose paintings hang in my house. Both were the most regular visitors at Du Montparnasse, and Brayton stayed there with our children for a week while we were vacationing in Geneva. For her part, Rebecca, always busy with the kids, survived by her own ingenuity and native practical sense, by her outgoing temperament. She's always been able to bulldoze into a new community, let people know what her intentions are, openly tell them what she likes and what she doesn't without being either rude or patronizing. People become her friends or don't, and she's not going to agonize about those who she reckons are difficult. In her social work, she shows, to my mind, excessive compassion and tends to absorb her clients' woes to a degree that can hinder good relationships in present-day capitalist societies where welfare is relief and compiling of records. She's the extrovert, I, the opposite, the dreamer. I had asked the Congress to release me after the second year, about September 1963. I wanted to return to teaching. I broached the idea of setting up a creative center like Mbari in Nairobi, and they all agreed it would be most welcome. They would help launch it. As the Congress acted only at the invitation of an accredited group of writers and artists in any country, they would need to write a formal letter to Paris. We would take it from there. Kampala was planned as the beginning of a 4-month tour of African countries, during which I was to study existing cultural projects and assess the needs. I was accompanied by my secretary, Francois Robinet. The tour took us to Brazzaville, Congo, Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, Yaoundé, Cameroon, Accra, Abidjan, Ivory Coast, Freetown, Sierra Leone, Dakar, Senegal. Then I proceeded alone to Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Zomba and Blantyre in Malawi, Lusaka, Salisbury, now Harare, and then back to Ibadan, where I joined my family for a vacation. Still more writers, actors, theater producers, artists, educationalists, politicians, laborers, students. These peopled my African beat.
One of the things that, we need to remember, is the contribution of South African intellectuals, outside the southern region. And, Eskia was one of those, pioneer intellectuals that moved out of South Africa after attaining his degree to share his knowledge, both in literature, in English, and more importantly, in creative writing with the rest of the continent.
When you could have been ready to enter into a commitment to a permanent place in Nigeria, you ran into another and different set of colonial educational politics. You thrived in freedom. You were well received, generously even. But you were always an outsider, a pebble in a mouthful of rice. You had to leave, even though voluntarily. Kenya, 1963 to 66. Denver, Colorado, 1966 to 68. Zambia, 1968 to 70. Back to Denver, then Philadelphia. Pennsylvania, 1974 to 77. Still accumulating experience, knowledge, but also hoping to strike anchor. A commitment not merely to that vague and general community called the Black world.
I remember one of the early poetry classes at the University of Denver, where it was a new class, it was a new semester that had begun, and there was no response. Zeke's frustration was so palpable. He pounded on the desk. He said, "I've got to have feedback," And all of a sudden, it was as if we, as a group of students, were not only invited, but we were given license to be part of our learning process. And that is what was significant about him.
So, for Mphahlele, he constantly asks, what is education? What makes the current education system different from what they had in their times? And so he will say education should instill a sense of pride in the people themselves, the people who are being educated, the subjects. But also education should be able to develop amongst people a sense of independence, the ability to be creative thinkers, the ability to develop a sort of an ideology of their own that they can sustain as citizens.
Exile politics turns one into a professional exile, and I would have none of it. You want a commitment to a place, an attachment in which you appear to invest your emotions and intellect and socializing energy. And only South Africa had this, for all the agony one is forever trying to survive. Towards the end of our 9-year stay in the United States, I became painfully aware that I was not contributing meaningfully, that is, meaningfully to myself, to American education and cultural goals, in spite of the stimulating intellectual environment.
He moves to the USA at the height of the civil rights movement, and moves in there also at a time when there's a whole range of debates that were taking place about, the awareness relating to the black people's place, within the global scheme of things.
There's an essay that he wrote, I think, in the 70s or so. Your history demands your heartbeat. And he was speaking necessarily about how one cannot but be passionate about things African. And from then on, he extrapolated on African American experiences, African experiences, and the literature that binds us together in a sense.
So one of the greatest contributions that Eskia makes around about this period is in creating the awareness that, African cultures, African identities was not something that would only be imagined, but it is indeed something that was still living, something that you could draw on, much as he did in his creative writing. And in that sense, therefore, what he did was to help in connecting, the intellectual tradition that was developing in South Africa with, the black intellectual tradition that was already, growing in the United States. And alongside a whole range of other scholars, they were able to create debate around, the awareness of our being, the awareness of ourselves.
This is in the Whirlwind, in which I forget the name of the critic now, but there was a controversial essay in there in which he challenged, certain predicates on which African American literature were based on. Now, it's not very easy to go into, say, the United States, become a professor there, and still be able to stand your own ground and say, look, there are things here that I don't agree with. And you are speaking to African Americans about their own cultural output. It's not very easy, but he was able to carry the debate through. And it was one of the highlights, I think, of his professional career in that sense, because here was someone who was able to sustain a debate that was published in journals and so forth, and to say, look, there must be something wrong here. That kind of critical intervention is what Prof is famous for. And not many academicians have the courage to do that. And you learn that from him, that once you approach matters both with your mind, but also with that passion that makes you sustain your argument, then you have nothing to fear.
Fiction, as a process, thrives on conflict, even though the final product demonstrates a single, total focus. For conflict and diversity, you need to be intimately familiar with particulars. I did not have these, and could not fake them even if I wanted to. Some people say they can write novels in which place does not matter, in which place and time do not need physical and temporal qualities. They can create a theater in the mind. This kind of experiment goes against everything I hold sacred in the composition of fiction. The tyranny of place is something I submit to. In the final count, it is a tyranny I would rather try to understand and deal with, so that I learn how to reconcile its imperatives, its diversities, in relation to that far-off divine event. Or is it that far away?
That made me say, what made me leave the country was because I had been banned from teaching, having resisted Bantu education. In 1952, three of us were dismissed, three teachers were dismissed, and we were not allowed to teach anywhere in the country. So because of that, and I really wanted to go to the classroom and keep in the classroom and teach, we decided to leave. This is why I applied for a teaching job in Nigeria, and where we went in 1957, my first teaching job there. And that is why I left. When I came back, I had lost my urban residential rights because I had been gone. I'd been away that long. So they said to me, you'd have to go to your homeland. Well, where is my homeland? And I said, South Africa is my homeland, I said. They said, well, we mean homeland, the real homeland. There were rough times in the late 70s, very rough times, and the death of Biko and the 76 schools revolt, etc. So we came at a dangerous time. And it was a time when we knew that it was a dangerous time for us, within me, the question would be, and even for Rebecca, the question would be, if we left the country because of Bantu education, and how do we come back to institutions of Bantu education? And again, my answer would be, you live in a country whether you love the laws or you don't, but you live in it because you want to help to put things right, and so there's no question about my being in any doubt over coming back.
It took me 5 years to get an ID in order to be paid by this. 5 years to get my ID. They were tossing us about, In
the 50s, I was just pouring it out in my writing, just pouring it out. I just feeling heartburn most of the time because I was angry after a day's work, after being humiliated during the day. That's right. And now my writing has come back to just expressing the feelings of a human being who's in specific situations and who's not always being battered about, you see.
Actually, this school here, this school that studied here, this crèche, was studied in my yard. I studied it. And then it grew to become a crèche, and then I gave it over to a lady to become the principal. And then I was disturbed by the children. I saw the children loitering about when the parents have gone to school. And it disturbed me because where I came from throughout my life abroad, I didn't see children roaming about. Children were well taken care of. They went to school. But I came here and then I realized, no, one must start creches and preschool. I went around the whole of the north, preaching to women, campaigning, going to churches, women's organizations, to encourage them to start creches and preschool, and they did.
In the years that since we came back, we spent usefully, and we spent them usefully. We didn't loll around. We created things in the way community development requires and demands. Our social consciousness became reinforced since our return and moving among those among our people who accepted us and loved our cooperation.
Something that we're almost ignoring here is we're talking about Zeke, the man, the teacher, but Zeke is also part of a family. He is a family. And there's a tragic strain here. You have parents moving from Africa to Europe, to the US, and back to Africa. The wandering takes its toll. And I've explained it somewhere that the children were the parents were able to adapt to the different cultures in which they found themselves. The children, on the other hand, adopted as much as they would object to that kind of statement. We saw, when we met them back in the States, we saw young American kids. I'm going way beyond accent now, way beyond accent. Everything about them. There was, if anything, at best, there was a tension between their Africanness and their Africanness as Americans. So they were almost true African Americans, and that obviously, it must be very hard for a parent to witness that the children are literally becoming so, not readily and with resistance, but they were nevertheless being absorbed into a foreign culture. And I think those are psychological dimensions that must have affected him,
I always prefer to do a handwritten version first before I put it on the computer, because I can't think on the computer and I can't feel on the computer. If I'm expressing any kind of passion, the computer is dead to me. Whereas if it flows through my pen, I feel that I'm expressing my thoughts and my feelings. So if I'm expressing my thoughts, it'll go on and I'll do it